To look at our topics today, we're going to cover federal budget. We have some late-breaking news as of actually just Monday with respect to funding for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth programs and Runaway for Homeless Youth Act programs. We also have some late-breaking news as of 2 days ago regarding the Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization, which includes McKinney-Vento's education subtitle and also Title I Part A. We will present information about the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act, which was reintroduced last week, as well as the Homeless Children and Youth Act, which was also reintroduced last week. And we'll also just give you a what's to come in terms of higher education, because that will be hot on the heels of ESEA, and there already has been some legislation introduced with respect to the FAFSA that would have a big impact on homeless and foster youth. Whoops. So first I'm going to turn it over now to Darla, who will give you the update, the latest on the federal budget.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all again today. So we have late-breaking news. The President released his budget on Monday, and this really is what begins the appropriations process on Capitol Hill. So what was in the President's budget? The Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act and the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, they're the only two federal programs that are specifically dedicated to serving children and youth. For the past 6 years, the President has not put any increase in funding for services in his budget. There's also, Congress has not increased funding for either of these programs in the past 6 years, despite a pretty dramatic increase in child and youth homelessness and a need for increased resources. So the President's budget has an increase for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. The President asked for $71.5 million for EHCY. This is a $6.5 million increase over the previous level. Also, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act saw an increase in the President's budget, a $7 million increase to $121 million. Also included was a ask for $2 million to do a national study for homeless youth. So these are proposed amounts. So the President is not Congress. The President's budget does not mean that his numbers will become law or become enacted. However, it's a very helpful starting place for the conversations and advocacy around pushing for increased resources for both of these programs. But it is Congress that will determine it. So our current funding level, the Education for Homeless Children and Youth is currently at $65 million. Only 22% of school districts are able to receive any subgrants because this number is so small. And there has been an 85% increase in the number of homeless children and youth identified by public schools since 2006 to 2007. Also, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is currently funded at $115 million. It's been flat funded that amount for years. Only 25% of organizations who apply for Runaway and Homeless Youth Act money actually receive the money. And there are grant applications scoring 100, 99 to 97 who are not receiving a grant award. And that's because the need for housing and services for homeless youth is much, much greater than the $115 million can meet. So Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funded programs have turned away over 10,000 young people since FY 2010, and Basic Center programs provide emergency shelter to minors. Also, transitional living programs have turned away over 23,000 youth since FY 2010 due to the lack of an available bed. HUD's point-in-time count counted on a single night in January 2013 over 46,000, nearly 47,000 unaccompanied homeless minors and transition-aged youth, and 53.9% of these young people were unsheltered. Also, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services surveyed over 650 homeless youth across the country, and the number one barrier identified by young people to accessing shelter was that the youth shelter was full.
And here we're going to look just a little bit at the correlation, or the lack of correlation rather, between the funding for the McKinney-Vento education program and the number of students who are identified by schools. This slide is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I need to say anything about it in terms of the numbers going up and the funding being flat. And this next slide here gives you a funding per student. So in 2006-2007, McKinney-Vento was $21 million. That worked out to be about $91 per homeless student. And then the most recent numbers we have for 2012-2013, it turns out to be about $52 per child. So even though McKinney-Vento really isn't a per student kind of program, it is one illustration of the great need for more resources for this program. Which brings us to our requests and what we're in terms of the advocacy. And I'm going to turn it back over to Darla to talk about this issue.
So what can we do? How can we increase the very clear need for more funding for both of these programs? So at a minimum, the president's request, we want that to happen. We want those increases because that would really be helpful. But considering the real needs, which are far greater than even what the president's budget asked for, we are going to be doing our appropriations request asking for the real needs. So this is what's going to be reflected in our advocacy and in the draft letters that we have prepared. So for the education of homeless children and youth, we're going to be asking for $115 million. This is an 85% increase above FY 2006 level to match the 85% increase in identified homeless youth since FY 2006. And for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, we're going to be asking for $165 million. This is what the program is currently authorized amount, which means this is what Congress determined was the right size or the right amount of funding for the program 7 years ago, which is when it was last authorized. So those are going to be our two big asks, and we're really going to need you to join us in pushing Congress to make these numbers a reality.
And I'll just throw in, for those of you who are working in school districts, I'm sure you're looking at $115 million from McKinney-Vento and saying that's not the real need. And for those of you who are working in youth service agencies, I'm sure you would look and to say the same thing. But we live in a funny town, Washington, D.C., where you have to do the dance between what is deemed as credible and what you know you really need. So that's why the request is framed as, look, at a minimum, we need what the president asked for. These programs have not had increases in a long, long time, but we also have a justifiable request given the huge increase. So just to let you know, we're doing our best to both work in this town that we live in and what the sort of parameters are for credible advocacy, but also let you know that we do acknowledge and we do know what the real needs are for these programs.
Yes. We would have a lot more zeros after these numbers if we had the power. So what can you do? How can you work with us, and how can we be coordinated so that we can really educate Congress about the value of these programs? Because believe it or not all members of Congress understand or know about these programs or really fully understand the value of these programs in their constituents' communities. So the members of the Appropriations Committee, the chair and the ranking member, they determine how much money all of the federal, many federal programs will get. How much money will they get? So we have to have the chair and the ranking member determine their priorities and concerns, and their deadline is usually around early March. So if you live in a state or a district of a member of the subcommittee, the Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee, it's really important that you reach out and ask them to support EHCY and RHYA funding in their letter. So they will be able to write a letter to the chair and the ranking member and say, this is what we really care about. We really need to increase funding for these programs for these reasons. And there are links to a sample letter and the committees on NACY's website now. So you can go there and download the letter and personalize it. We have listed here the key states. These are the key states on the Labor HHS subcommittee, appropriation subcommittee. So please take note. If you live in any of these states, then we need you. We need you to engage with us to help us move Congress forward and really elevate these programs.
And I'm just going to add one thing too, because if you go on the NACY website now, you'll see a Word document that you can download. You can edit it, take out things. You can add things about your own community and state, and then it's great to fax that as opposed to other methods of sending it. Just given the timeliness, we're going to be working on adding the sort of web-based letters where you type in your zip code and do all of that. But we have also been told by congressional offices that they really pay a lot of attention to faxes that come in, letters on letterhead. So we're going to try to make it easy for you, but also recognize that we don't want them just to get a bunch of form letters, which are easier for them to disregard. So the slide that Darla just covered was for appropriations if you happen to live in those states, but there's another thing that everybody can do regardless of where you live, and that's the next slide.
Yes. So we have to have multiple different outreaches to members of Congress in order to really elevate these programs. So the other thing that we do every year is we work on a Dear Colleague. Basically, a Dear Colleague is when members of Congress write letters to each other saying what they care about, really trying to encourage other senators and other House representatives to care about a federal program or to care about a particular piece of legislation. So we will have a Dear Colleague letter asking for adequate funding for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth and Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs. The more members of Congress that sign on to this Dear Colleague letter, the stronger message it sends to the Appropriations Committee, because if there's a lot of members of Congress who are saying the same thing, and we want them to say, these programs matter, they're really important, and specifically in the context of appropriations, then the chances of these programs getting increased resources and funding will greatly increase. And because NACY and the network are not constituents of every state and congressional district in the country, we really need you as constituents to urge all of your federal representatives to sign on to the Dear Colleague. We'll have one in the Senate and we'll have one in the House, and you can sign up to get alerts about when to do this, who needs to be contacted by signing up at either NACY's website or my website, the National Network for Youth.
And know that this is something that hasn't happened yet. We expect it will happen in the next couple of weeks, and we often aren't given a whole lot of time. So, you may see like, deadline, urge your member to sign on to the Dear Colleague by, and then a date that's 4 days. We're trying to avoid that, but we don't control even our champions. So we will try to make sure that there's more time for that, but just be on the lookout for it, because chances are we won't have a huge amount of time to turn it around.
Yeah, last year, unfortunately, I think we only had 3 days to get folks to sign on.
So that is sort of our budget update. We're going to switch topics now and talk about the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which includes McKinney-Vento's education subtitle and Title I Part A. Also here we have late-breaking news as of this week. In fact, 2 days ago, the Student Success Act, H.R. 5, was really reintroduced in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is almost identical to the legislation that the entire House passed 2 years ago, and it is moving quickly. In fact, there is a full committee markup scheduled for next Wednesday. So that is moving rapidly, and then it will probably be on the House floor soon. When it's a fast process, it means that it's a partisan process. So that one's moving quickly. On the Senate side, there was a discussion draft, which isn't quite a bill, but it's basically a starting point for conversations. That was released earlier, January 13th, and there was a deadline on Monday for submitting comments from stakeholders, which of course we did. And the Senate Health Committee also is expected to mark up this legislation in February soon. So we have both chambers, House and Senate, moving really quickly on education legislation to reauthorize elementary and secondary education. What happens to it ultimately depends on really the extent to which the Senate Republicans can work with the Senate Democrats to get a bill to the floor that the president would actually sign. But nonetheless, we take all of this, a lot of activity, and we take it seriously. The overarching themes are in both legislations are reducing the role of federal government and increasing flexibility, again, reflecting the fact that the Republican Party controls both House and Senate currently. In terms of what's actually in these drafts regarding homelessness, well, for the January 13th discussion draft, there really wasn't a whole lot. It did reauthorize McKinney-Vento. There was an increased emphasis on identification of homeless students. That has been cited as a persistent issue both by the Government Accountability Office and other reports, a requirement that state coordinators be able to sufficiently carry out their duties, clarification on immediate enrollment for homeless students, that they need to be immediately enrolled even if they've missed application or enrollment deadlines. There's some language about protecting the privacy of homeless students, so that information about their living situation is part of their educational record and cannot be shared with people who aren't authorized to have it. For example, landlords, really getting at the practice of some overzealous verification efforts. And what ends up happening, as many of you know, is that in the attempt to verify the residency of a homeless student who's in a doubled up situation, for example, both families can end up getting evicted when the landlord finds out that they're there and they're not supposed to be there. So that's good language. What's not good is that the Senate discussion draft actually lowers the authorized funding level to what is currently appropriated. So as Darla mentioned earlier, the authorized funding amount is really what Congress is saying is the right size for the program. And this would actually shrink it by $5 million to what it's currently authorized at. This is not a specific attack on McKinney-Vento. This is really sort of a party line in terms of freezing federal funding for federal education programs. So that's what we had in the Senate discussion draft on the 13th. And then in this week's legislation on the House side, H.R. 5, that legislation was overall much stronger. It included everything that was in the previous draft, everything that was in the previous slide, rather, everything that was in the Senate discussion draft. And it also does some additional things. It enhances the school stability portion of McKinney-Vento. So we all know that homeless students have the right to stay in their school of origin. We have good guidance from the Department of Education saying that really needs to be a decision made on best interest, which looks at individual factors related to the student's education. And this H.R. 5 would essentially put that into law and say that school districts must presume that staying is in the best interest unless they've done an individual determination that shows otherwise, in which case they put it in writing and the parent or youth can dispute. So that would be in law. Some liaison responsibilities specific to unaccompanied homeless youth would be spelled out, including a requirement to notify unaccompanied youth of their independent student status for higher education for the FAFSA. The school of origin definition is amended in the House bill to include feeder schools. So for children who are transitioning between elementary and middle or between middle and high, if they're in a feeder school pattern, they would be, school of origin could mean school district of origin, again, if that's in their best interest. There's a requirement for state coordinators to list liaisons on the state education website. Most state coordinators already do that, but it's good to have it in the law so people can find out easily who their district liaison is, and also requirements to more broadly distribute public notice of the educational rights of homeless children and youth. So that was in the 2013 bill, which was reauthorized just 2 days ago. So this is in the current House discussion draft. But what's missing? What's not in either the Senate discussion draft or in the House bill that was just reauthorized that are part of the recommendations that NACY has been working with liaisons and state coordinators on for a very long time? Well, on this slide, you have some of the things that are as yet unaddressed. These were items that were included in legislation several years ago. The requirement that homeless liaisons have sufficient time and training to carry out their duties, that they must participate in professional development, preschool. Now, we all know there are many challenges with our young children who are experiencing homelessness, and that's a tremendous proportion of kids who are experiencing homelessness. So we have recommendations for improved access to preschool, credit accrual, and extracurricular participation for homeless youth, not as yet addressed. Requirements for states to monitor all school districts, and also the Title I Part A set-aside uses, really putting in law that the set-asides need to be for all school districts, whether kids are in targeted, non-participating, or school-wide schools, that the amount needs to be based on a needs assessment that is real, and also that, again, that the funds can be used for transportation and liaisons, which, as you know, is now allowable, but we'd like to see that in the authorizing statute, not just in appropriations language. So this forms the bulk of our advocacy for the next month at least, and probably longer. What we can do, again, this is the legislation that's moving the fastest. There's already a date next week for the House bill, and Senate will be moving shortly thereafter. So this is the one where the opportunity is now. Educating senators and representatives about child and family youth in your community, the impacts about McKinney-Vento and Title I. Again, as Darla said, many members of Congress and their staff don't know about these programs. It's also important to show specific examples of where changes in the law are needed, either because there's something in the law that's caused harm, or because there's something that really needs to happen and it's not in the law. So those are things that are really imperative to do, specifically around the provisions that we've been talking about, what's sort of on the table, if you will. And it's also very important when you're connecting with legislators to connect this issue to something else they've already gone on record as caring about. For example, many members are very interested in trafficking right now, mental health, healthcare. So do a little research, and McKinney-Vento, homelessness affects every aspect of a child and a youth's life. So we need to make the connections to show how it's relevant to something that they're already on record about. Here are the key states for the Senate and the House in terms of the education committees who will be marking up and voting on this legislation this month. So we've listed them there. If you don't live in one of the key House or Senate states, then the name of the game is to get your member to write to the chair and ask them to prioritize, because that's everybody has a stake in education. So everybody's going to be writing to the chair. And believe me, it makes a big difference. Without going into details, there's one senator who has one particular issue, and she could hold up the entire bill because of it. So it's not as if you don't live in one of these key districts or states, there's nothing to be done. There's just a different role. We have a very short amount of time here. If you know somebody, if you can get in, even if you can't meet with the member, that's ideal. But if you can't, and given the timing, then we're really looking at letters. So again, there are materials on the website under legislative updates, letters that you can customize, and please customize them. And there are also links to all of these committees. If you want more information, please connect with me directly. With that, I'm turning it back. And I know we're going fast, but we want to have time for questions. And you will get a copy of this webinar in an hour. An hour after this webinar is over, you'll get an email and you can download this. And so you'll have it all right at your desktop. I'm going to turn it back over to Darla now to talk about RHYA reauthorization.
Yes, thank you. There is a lot moving, so we thank you all for joining us. So the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, we've been talking about it, but what exactly does it do? So it provides funding for street outreach, which builds relationship with young people, provides preventative services, family intervention, referrals for housing and services, and it also provides counseling, food, all sorts of other things, both street-based and also in a drop-in center. It also provides for what we call a basic center program. It's a 21-day youth-appropriate emergency shelter. It's for minors who have run away from home or are homeless, and it includes a lot of intensive family-based reunification whenever it's safe and appropriate for that young person. It also provides transitional living. This is longer term housing for young people who are homeless between the ages of 16 and 21. It provides up to 18 months of care, and it focuses a lot on health, education, positive youth development, and employment. It also provides for a national hotline, 1-800-RUNAWAY, and provides national training and technical assistance to all of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act grantees across the country. So the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act would reauthorize the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, which is a 41-year-old program. It technically expired in 2013, and this bill was introduced in the Senate last year and made it through the Senate Judiciary Committee, but it didn't make it out of the Senate, and there was no bill introduced in the House. So the bill this year, the bill number is S262. And some of the key updates that this legislation makes to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs is, one, it includes new provisions to combat human trafficking and discrimination. It also would increase the length of stay in basic centers, that's those emergency shelter programs for homeless minors. It would extend it from 21 to 30 days. And it would also require RHYA grantees to assist youth in completing the free application for federal student aid. It also would add funding, an actual funding amount for the national prevalence study. Currently, there's no suggested funding level for the national study. It just has a national study. And then it maintains funding for the programs at $165 million. Keeping this amount has been a battle, and it will continue to be a battle because Congress is trying to reauthorize bills at the level they've been appropriated. And since RHYA has only ever been appropriated at $115 million, it will remain a challenge to keep this funding level in there, but it is what we have in law now. So it was introduced, like I had said, in the Senate on January 27th, very strong bipartisan. We had 2 Democrat senators and 2 Republican senators. We had Leahy, Collins, Ayotte, and Booker. We're currently in negotiations with some members of Congress in the House. It is looking very strong, like we will have a bill introduced in the early part of this year in the House, and that will dramatically increase the chances that full reauthorization can happen. There was a bill that the House passed that made some amendments to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, but it was a very small 2-page bill that just added 5 references to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And everything that was in that House bill is included in the bigger, more comprehensive bill, S262. So our message to the House is we don't disagree with the bill that you passed out of the House, but it's not a full reauthorization. And a full reauthorization is going to do even more to increase services and protections for our very vulnerable young people. So what can you do? We have a sign-on letter. We're asking organizations to sign on to show their support for S262. You can use that link and sign your organization on.
Great.
Thank you. Back to you, Barbara.
All right, we got 2 more. So moving on to housing and urban development, the HUD Homeless Assistance programs. Again, for those of you who come from a school district background and are relatively new, here's just a real quick summary of what those programs are. They provide funding for emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, supportive services. And the issue at hand, there are several issues at hand, but one is that the HUD definition of homelessness excludes families and youth who are staying temporarily with others because they have no place else to go. So referred to as our doubled up or tripled up. It also excludes families and youth who are living in motels if they are using their own income to pay for the motel. So that's one big issue, is the definition. Also, we know that in recent years, HUD has essentially forced communities to prioritize programs for chronically homeless, and that has really come at the expense of programs for families and youth. So even regardless of what's going on in the community, even if the greater need is for families or youth and they have things in pretty well order for chronically homeless adults and veterans, there's still a priority, and that means that those fundings are ranked lower, or those programs are ranked lower and receive less funding. And then lastly, as many of you are keenly aware, given the time of the year, is that the count is not reflective. And even though that's different than eligibility, it still leads to families and children and youth being essentially invisible in their communities. Bipartisan legislation. This was reintroduced. It was in the House and Senate last year, but it was introduced very late in the session, very close to the end of July before August break. So it's reintroduced now at the beginning of the session. Also bipartisan, House, also bicameral, House and Senate. Dianne Feinstein and Rob Portman in the House, in the Senate, and then in the House by Steve Stivers and Dave Loebsack. It is currently supported, actually I need to update this, it's currently supported by 331 organizations, including 57 national organizations. So it has broad support among children, youth, families, education, and homeless organizations. What does it actually do? It does three things. First, it amends HUD's definition of homelessness to include children and youth who are verified by school liaisons, RHYA programs, Head Start programs, health care for the homeless, other federal programs like domestic violence programs, for example, financial aid administrators. Basically, federal programs, the 7 federal programs that have a broader definition and are targeted towards children and youth and families. If you are verified as homeless under that statute, then you're eligible, you're verified as homeless, or you're considered homeless for HUD as well. So it essentially gets rid of a lot of the regulation and the rules about having to move around a lot, having to prove you've been staying with someone for 14 days, and creates a streamlined process for referrals. The second thing it does is it would prohibit HUD from prioritizing one group over another. Really, communities would be guided by their own local needs assessment. So if the biggest need in the community was single adults, they could continue to prioritize that way. But if the needs were different for families or youth, then they would be allowed to go ahead and prioritize that, and HUD would be required to honor the local needs assessment. And then lastly, there would be a requirement that data from all federal homeless programs are reported to Congress, so we don't have this mismatch between what schools say, what HUD say, what youth programs say. We would really have a good composite view of all federal efforts. What can be done? Again, here, since we're at an early stage, it really doesn't matter where the state is from in terms of co-sponsors. Sometimes the way to get legislation to move forward is just to gain the number of co-sponsors. So the same thing that Darla was talking about with RHYA, getting more people on board sends a strong message to committee leadership and says, this is a bill that's got support, we need to move it forward. So we need Republican co-sponsors. That is something that is also essential in this 114th Congress. We really need Republican co-sponsors in order for the bill to move forward. So what you can do is setting up meetings to discuss the issues. This particular legislation really merits some discussion because there are a certain amount of mythology and misinformation floating around. So it's good to set up meetings to discuss the issues. There are organizational endorsements and take action letters on a campaign website. HelpHomelessKidsNow.org is a campaign website, and you can look at it. You can see a map of the U.S., who's endorsed it in terms of organizations in your state or your community. You can add your organization via the website. You can send a letter to Congress via the website. You can also look for youth and family stories. Invisible People TV came out last week to the briefing that we had to introduce the bill and videotaped some young people who spoke at that event. So we know that the stories are really going to be the most compelling thing here. We can look at the discrepancies between the data. That's not necessarily going to move somebody, but showing a family staying in a motel where they're paying for it and they don't know if they can continue to pay for it, but they're not eligible, or a young person who's going from couch to couch. These are the sorts of stories that make this issue very real. We do have some special states and districts, even though we're not quite at the committee markup stage yet. These are states listed below where there are people of influence, and would be especially good to have them be co-sponsoring this legislation. Turning over now to our Director of Higher Education, Ms. Zakia Lee, to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in the higher ed world.
Thank you, Barbara. So as Barbara mentioned, I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the legislation that's going on in the higher ed world. And I'll start with talking about the FAST Act. And so this is expected to take action following ESEA in the Senate and possibly the House. But the FAST Act is basically, it's the Financial Aid Simplification Act. It was introduced by Chairman Alexander and Senators Burr from North Carolina, Isaacson from Georgia, King from Maine, Booker from New Jersey, and Bennett from Colorado. What this does is it reduces the FAFSA down just to 2 questions. It asks about the household size for the student and then the income from the previous 2 tax years. And so as you can imagine, what this does is it eliminates those questions that ask about homeless youth, foster youth, any of those youth that are independent and living outside of being with their parents. It doesn't ask them that at all. So students may be including folks in their household that aren't really there. Or if they are homeless, they may be including their family. And again, if they have that prior income from 2 tax years, then they may not be eligible to receive certain amounts of financial aid. So as you can see, this is a problem for unaccompanied homeless youth. We pointed out in foster youth, and we pointed out last time that this is rather gimmicky to shorten the FAFSA because there's an assumption there are far too many questions, but we don't want to have the questions that identify our homeless and foster youth eliminated. And it's even getting some pushback in the financial aid community because there's more needed to assess a student's financial aid. The next thing that I'll talk to you about is Senator Murray's Homeless and Foster Higher Education Bill. It's expected to be reintroduced this upcoming year. And what some of the things that it does is it clarifies the age of youth. Currently, we look at youth that are 21 and under when we look at their homeless status. However, in terms of higher education access, unless you're 24 by age, you cannot be considered independent. So we have students that are 22 and 23 that have to jump through several hoops if they're still homeless. It improves FAFSA for homeless youth to be, just make it a little more advantageous so they don't have to go off and search for a bunch of letters and things like that when they are 22 to 23-year-olds. It also requires single points of contact on each campus, and so many of you may have heard us talk about our SPOCs before. They're phenomenal. They're kind of the parallel to what a McKinney-Vento liaison is in the K-12 system. A lot of you always ask, well, who will help my student on the higher education end? Right now, we have SPOCs in some of our statewide networks. We have 14. We have about 350 SPOCs across the country, but there are over 5,000 higher education institutions. So it would put SPOCs on all campuses. It would require campuses to have a plan in place for housing during breaks. As you know, when dorms close or they're just not there, students will be on the street or they have to go out and find shelters or other places to go to. So it will require schools to put a plan in place for that. And then it will implement a federal grievance process. Sometimes our students get pushed back from the financial aid offices and they're told that, well, we don't really believe that you're homeless, or they don't get to be identified properly. And so the students, they don't really have a source to go to now for an appeal process. So it would be a federal grievance process in place. We'd like you to stay tuned for more, again, because this is going to be reintroduced, and we had a lot of action going on when it was first introduced last year. What we are calling on you to do, this just follows suit from some of the things that Barbara and Darla has already said, but in these specific states, and it's Tennessee, not Texas, right?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot to change that on this one. Sorry.
It is okay. I just was going to say Texas again, but
My fault.
Tennessee, Colorado, North Carolina, Georgia, New Jersey, and Maine, we need you to write the senators who introduced S108 and explain why it is problematic for unaccompanied homeless and foster youth, and get Youth Voice involved if you can. They most certainly know that they want to be counted in the FAFSA process and make sure that they're looked at as being independent. You can go to this website, www.senate.gov, to find out more information about how to contact your senator. And stay tuned for more advocacy. It'll be available on our NACY webpage. As you know, Barbara is phenomenal with getting that stuff out on our legislative updates. And look at our NACY Facebook page as well.
Thank you, Sakia. So right now you're probably saying, oh, wow, that's a whole lot of information. There are a lot of bill numbers, there are a lot of processes, there are a lot of provisions, and you've been calling on us to do a lot. So how do we figure out what to do first when we're in a time like this, which is really, really unprecedented, I think, in terms of just the number of issues, the importance of the issues, and definitely the speed of the issues. We're not in a situation where we can go, oh yeah, well, they've been working on McKinney-Vento reauthorization for 8 years now and they haven't done anything, so nothing's going to happen. Because if we take that attitude and we don't act and it does happen, then we're forfeiting the futures of many, many young people and many vulnerable children. So we have to take due diligence and take all of this very seriously. So how do you figure out what to do first? Well, the congressional schedule determines a lot of this. So it may be that you are in the higher education world and the thought of losing the questions on the FAFSA for unaccompanied homeless youth makes your heart stop in its tracks, which it should. But that's not the bill that's up right away. The bill that's up right away right now is K-12. So part of it is knowing what's going first, but keeping an eye on what's coming next because it's going to be right around the corner. So right now I would say the K-12 bills, there's a committee markup date. There's an attended expectation of bills getting to the floor by this month or March. We also know, though, that with the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act and the Homeless Children and Youth Act, whether or not they move forward depends on the support that we generate and the number of members who sign on to them as co-sponsors. So we also have that as another really important tier, is that if we want those bills to move, then we need to be diligent in terms of the co-sponsors. And of course, the money issues are a little bit longer window of time with appropriations. We put it first because it just happens and we know everyone's really interested in money. Which isn't to say that, I'm going to wait on that, but just to say that there's a slightly longer window of time. So that means you could have the meetings with your members and set something up about that. You could also set up a meeting and talk about everything and say, we've got, I have a meeting with you. You're my member of Congress. There are 5 bills that are happening right now. I want to talk to you about each of them. So you can look at the congressional schedule. You can look at where you live. Did your state's acronym appear on any of those bullets? And that means that you have a special opportunity because of where they happen to sit. So that can be another way to help you filter out, how do I act? Where can I do the most good here? So that's another question to ask yourselves. And then last but certainly not least, are any of your congressional delegation Republicans, whether they're senators or whether they're U.S. representatives? That is the majority party in both chambers, and so there is where we especially need support. We do have support of Republican members of Congress for both of these bills. We need more, and we need them to be vocal in adding their names to all of these efforts. So that's another consideration, is just sort of the party makeup and recognizing the reality of our House and Senate right now. Just a little reminder about, and Darla and I will sort of share this, and Sakia too, please jump in. I'm going to actually start with the last bullet, which is, you're listening to a webinar from 2 national organizations. We are very grassroots. We are actually very small staffed, and we also are not constituent. So we really, we can put on webinars and tell you what's in the bills and give you our advice on what to do. We can actually move things the way they need to be moved if members of Congress aren't hearing from the people who put them into office. They don't even have to meet with us. They can just delete our emails. In fact, I'm sure they probably do in some instances, and that's not a good thing. But if they've heard from a constituents where we've been able to make that bridge and have a constituent contact, it makes it much easier for us to do our jobs because that is what they care about. Darla, and Sakia, do you want to jump in on this piece here as well?
Yes, please, please, please. I think please know that your elected officials may have no idea about the value of any of these federal programs that we have spoken to you. They were elected by their constituents and they're in office to serve their constituents. So it's really important that they hear locally about what public schools are doing, what runaway and homeless youth programs are doing. I can't tell you how valuable it is going into a meeting or having constituents say, this is the program, this is what we're doing in your community, and they're like, oh, I've heard of that, wow, you get this money. So there really is a need to make that local connection, and making that connection is extremely, extremely powerful. Like Barbara said, we have very small staff, and we obviously keep very busy. Whenever we send alerts, like send this letter, call your member of Congress, we mean it. And what you say does have power. It does have an impact.
All right, I think we are going to go on now. Just to say that we do, one other thing, we do need specific examples that helps us make the case. We need people who are willing to share, to organize meetings, to share news articles. There's power in numbers. So when you get this PowerPoint or you get our legislative alerts, please do forward them to the people that you work with and let us know what you're up to. If you get a good response, if you get no response, it helps us to be able to strategize as well. I think, if I haven't said it before, the Facebook pages are Facebook. I don't use Facebook, but we have a great Facebook page thanks to Patricia and Alexis. They are great for keeping some of the most late-breaking items that are happening. So I think I'm going to see now. Patricia, are you able to join us? Patricia was having audio issues, so we'll see if she's here.
Barbara, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So we can go to questions now, and the first question actually is for you. The question is whether requiring transportation to the school of origin for the remainder of the school year once the student becomes permanently housed, whether that will be on the table for reauthorization of the McKinney-Vento Act.
The answer is yes. In fact, I didn't mention it because it's a little bit of a nuance in the sense that the U.S. Department of Education made an interpretation of McKinney-Vento to say that transportation to the school of origin was only required while a student was currently homeless, which of course means that if they get housing in the middle of the academic year, they certainly have the right to stay in their school of origin, but it's a real challenge to get there. And much of the U.S. Department's their grounds for their interpretation was because the word homeless was before the word child in the transportation requirement language. The House bill strikes that word homeless before child. So the Department of Education's grounds for that interpretation are gone in the House bill that was introduced this week. And also in the Senate discussion draft. So the short answer is yes, and that's the longer answer.
Thanks, Barbara. I've got another question for you. The question is if you could expand a little bit on what you said, that in the McKinney-Vento Act reauthorization proposal, there would be a requirement that public notice of students' rights would be distributed a little more widely. Can you just say a little bit about what that might mean practically for school districts, charter schools, and also for states?
Well, right now, the way the law is worded is that public notice shall be disseminated in places where students receive services under this act. So, a strict reading of the law would say, well, you need to post public notice in, the front offices of your school building or other places, maybe if you've got a tutoring program in a shelter there. And so what the proposed legislation says is it would need to be in shelters, service agencies, basically places that many liaisons are already posting public notice, but would, arguably be outside of what's strictly required. We have, and I should have mentioned this, there is actually a summary of what's in both bills and links to the bills themselves on the website, or you can just shoot me an email and I'll tell you exactly what the language says. But essentially, this just puts the best practice of where to post notice in the law. And it also says that the notice needs to be in a manner and form that's understandable. So getting at this issue of the fact that some people may not, you don't want a very legal document and you don't want a document in English if that's not the predominant language of where you're living.
Great, thanks, Barbara. I've got a question for Darla now, and Darla, you covered this in the slides, but I just wanted to make sure that people were clear on it since we did get a question on it. In the proposed changes to RHYA, what will the maximum stay at a basic center program be?
Yeah, so it's currently 21, and it would be at 30 days as an allowable length of stay.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sakia, we've got one for you. I hope you're ready for it. This is going to be easy for you. If a college student has been supported by his parents for 2 years, can he then apply for FAFSA as an independent student if his parents are no longer able to help?
The short answer is no. The reason why, as a student, there are several different ways a student could be considered independent. However, if the family is just not able to help or support, that's not one of the situations that will allow a student to be considered independent. So that student would still have to provide parental information. Now, if the student was unaccompanied homeless youth by definition from the Department of Education, then the student could be independent. But we've been seeing this a lot lately where students go off to college and unfortunately the family just can't support them, but no, they wouldn't be able to be considered independent.
Great, thanks for that clarification. We've got another question in that I think is probably for Barbara. You talked about the Homeless Children and Youth Act and how that would amend HUD's definition of homeless. There's a question on, is there any proposed legislation that would change the definition of homeless that's in the education subtitle of the McKinney-Vento Act?
Neither the Senate discussion draft nor the House bill, H.R. 5, amend the definition of homelessness in the McKinney-Vento Education Act. There aren't really any anticipated changes to the definition of homelessness. If there are questions about why or concerns, but that really isn't something that's been discussed where there's been need for changes, with the small exception of, not small, but actually big exception, which I think is, I don't want to get into too much detail, but we don't know yet what's happening in terms of the education of children and youth in foster care within the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Neither of the bills that have been put forward so far address that. But certainly moving forward, if there are attempts to address the education of all children and youth in foster care in ESEA, which we certainly hope for, then that will mean actually revisiting the awaiting foster care placement part of the definition of homelessness. So we certainly expect that to be a hot topic moving forward.
Great, thanks, Barbara. You anticipated another question with your answer, so that was perfect. And another question for Sakia, and there's a question about whether a college student older than 23 is covered or protected under the McKinney-Vento Act. So I think there's actually two questions here. One is, how does the McKinney-Vento Act pertain to college students, if at all? And then the second question is, what about for higher education and for the FAFSA, what happens when a student turns 23 and 24, and how is that addressed, or 22 even?
Got it. So for the first question, the McKinney-Vento Act doesn't cross over into higher education. In terms of a student's homeless status, the same definitions are used as the McKinney-Vento definitions, but it's the College Cost Reduction and Access Act, completely separate act that allows the provisions for homeless students to be considered independent if they're unaccompanied. For our students that are 23 and they're homeless and they're no longer considered to be a youth because they're no longer 21, they have to complete a dependency override if they're not with their parents and they're still homeless, and they have to turn in other forms of documentation to be considered independent based on them being unaccompanied and, well, I can't even say unaccompanied, based on them being homeless and 23. When they turn 24, then if they're still homeless and they're 24, then they're just considered to be an independent student. They get whatever aid that they can get. And it really just boils down to, right now, because there's not any legislation to mandate anything, the campus supports that have kind of developed in a more grassroots way, our statewide networks, were able to provide some things similar to McKinney-Vento, so clothing closets, food on campus, connections to on and off campus supports. But again, that's why this legislation is so important, because without it, there's nothing really that's in place. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sakia. We don't have any additional questions coming in the chat box right now, so I think we're ready to go ahead and move on.
Okay, so before you go, there's going to be an evaluation that's going to pop up in the browser. It'll also be sent to you via email. So please take just 2 minutes to help us provide better content in the future. Again, as I mentioned, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to this PowerPoint so you can use it, share it. We're also going to repeat this webinar on February 23rd to give updates on all of these. A lot of things happening. It's really sort of every 10 minutes there's something new, there's a development. So we're going to do this again February 23rd to provide updates on all of this. If you want information before then, again, our legislative alerts and liking us on Facebook and following us on Twitter are good ways to stay in touch. And we are all, I think it's safe to say, fairly OCD with our emails as well. So you have our contact information on the slides. Please feel free to get in touch with us if you have follow-up questions, more specific questions. And we just really want to thank you for your time and your interest, and really, again, ask for your support moving forward. There's a great potential, there's a great challenge, and we really need to be all hands on deck.
Yeah, thank you all very much. There will definitely be updates at our next webinar at the end of the month because things are moving quickly. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Take care.